Have you ever wondered if your child has a learning disability or a learning disorder? And if they do, can you homeschool? Well, I am so excited because today I interview Lori Horner, education therapist, and she explains to us what these differences are, learning disability, learning disorder, and how you can be successful as a homeschooling parent if your child has one of these issues. And I just want to note that Lori and I, in an effort to keep our video not too long, even though it's still probably a little long, we didn't go into great detail defining these terms. So look in the show notes below where we have professional definitions of words like dyslexia, dysgraphia, etc. But I know you're going to love this video, and I'm so excited to share it with you.
I was all alone, but then you came along.
Well, welcome to the Home Educated Mind channel. I'm so excited to have Lori Horner with us. Again, today you might recognize her from our video on homeschool reviewers. But today she is with us because we are going to talk about being an educational therapist. That's what she does professionally. And we're going to talk about what that is. And as a homeschooling parent, is this something that you might need to consider for support as you're educating your children? And I kind of think it is a big thing because I just recently read something like 33% of the children today have an IEP, which is an independent educational plan. And so if 33% of our kids have something like that, then it's bound to affect our homeschool families. So Lori, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. I'm excited to talk about this today. So just for our viewers, maybe you could start just by explaining even what is an educational therapist and what do they do?
All right. So educational therapist is similar to cognitive therapy, where we are talking to students and sometimes adults in order to help rewire certain misconnections in the brain that have occurred over time or at birth in order to improve cognitive functioning so that we can help children not to have accommodations the rest of their life, right? So we're helping to rewire the neural connections in order to overcome any disabilities or differences in their learning.
Okay, so I'm thinking about some of those terms like, would you say cognitive?
Mm-hmm. Cognitive functioning.
Cognitive functioning. So how would we define that?
So basically it's the way you think and the strategies you use in order to overcome problems or learning. You know, we all have to have strategies for how we learn things. And generally students who have inefficient learning strategies are the ones that we are helping to help get them to learn in such a way or to master material so that they're using effective strategies in order to overcome those issues that they have.
Okay, so you are helping them to figure out what their, I was going to say issues are, or learning issues are, and how to overcome them, have strategies so they're not forever held back or not able to do things because they may have these issues and don't really know how to manage or compensate, so to speak.
Yeah, you know, most of the time, all of these learning disabilities are fairly newly diagnosed in the period of like educational history, right? So we have a lot of adults who come up and say, you know, I think I may have had dyslexia and I didn't know it. I had such a struggle learning when I was a kid. I didn't, you know, I just couldn't get through the material. It was really hard. And they learned strategies, right? They learned how to overcome them, but they may not have been very efficient or effective, or they may have learned them much later. And so what we'd like to do is help our students to help those strategies in order to overcome those earlier so that they're not having those struggles, and that it opens up a world of opportunities for them that they may not have had otherwise.
Right. And I'm an example, right? I'm certain that I'm dyslexic and wasn't diagnosed. I don't even think they knew about it when I was a kid. And exactly, I mean, the piece, I mean, I think most dyslexics, most people do learn strategies, but the piece that I appreciate about what you're saying and can say from experience is when you don't learn the way that everybody else does, and you look around you, say you're in a classroom or a situation, and you recognize that deficiency, it really plays with your psyche. So I would say one of the worst things for me was I lived probably my whole education life, like even almost through college, well, probably through college, feeling like I was lesser, feeling like I was didn't didn't meet the mark, and felt really bad about who I was, and actually shamed, felt like I kind of had to hide sometimes my inability, in my case with dyslexia, to read, right? So if people said, well, let's read this out loud, I was like, oh no, because I know I could read it, but I knew what came out of my mouth was not what it said, so all of those things to say, the shame factor and the fear factor of like, well, I can't try,
Right.
I'm afraid I'll fail, or what people say.
Right. Yeah. Students with learning differences, learning disabilities, frequently we are discovering have a lack of a growth mindset, right? They say I can't, right? They make up for not being able to do things in perfectionistic ways or in just defeated ways, because you try and you try and you try and you try so hard, and if you keep failing, then why try, right? And so we come up against parents, teachers, other adults in their life who believe that they were born that way and it's not going to change. And so,
Are you saying the mindset of the not trying? Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Or you have adults who believe that however you were born is just the way it is, and so we're going to throw accommodations at you to make it easier for you. But the brain is a muscle, right? And so as we exercise it and as we throw new ideas at it and new strategies, it can grow and it can change and it can develop. And the science with this is just amazing. And so when you come at it with your brain can change and you can overcome any differences in learning that you have with appropriate strategies and with appropriate tools, right? We just have to get those to you, and those look different to each child based on the situation and issues that they might face.
Right. Okay, so I want to ask you why you became an educational therapist, because if you have saw our previous video, you know that Lori has homeschooled her two girls. One's a college graduate and working, and one's in college. And she's also, like I said, a homeschool reviewer and done that for many years. So, but becoming an educational therapist, this is newer, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So, yeah.
Why did you do that? Why did you do it?
Sure. So, I have always loved reading. It's always been my thing. And so in order to maintain educational licensing, I was having to take graduate classes every 2 years or so, and I was doing them in reading specialist. And then I started seeing more and more students come through for portfolio reviews that were just having issues that were deeper than reading issues. They were math issues, they were attention issues, they were dysgraphia, dyslexia. They were all these issues that was some undiagnosed, some diagnosed, and trying to help parents. And then somebody introduced me to National Institute for Learning Development, and I started pursuing that, and I loved that it was the brain as a whole and strategies for learning and overcoming any learning difference that you might have versus just a reading specialist. And I say that just, not meaning that it is not worth doing, but there are students who need more than reading tutoring or reading specialists.
Right. Now, so you saw in the homeschool population, so to speak, a lot of these learning issues kind of showing up, and felt like, wow, there's a great need for this understanding and resources in the homeschool community. And also, don't you think too, like, I think homeschooling is such a great way to address, like, if you have a student that struggles,
Absolutely.
homeschooling is wonderful because you can, everybody has an IEP, right?
Exactly. It's all individualized.
Everybody has an independent, is that what it's called? Individualized?
Individualized education plan. Yes.
It has that. So you can really, and like I said, for me, as somebody who struggled, my struggle was comparison. My struggle was seeing that I was working, but I wasn't where my friends were. And so that's where that shame or embarrassment came in. So I learned to hide it, right? I hid it. And what that really did is it kept me from learning. But if I had, if I was homeschooled or I had an individual learning plan, then I wouldn't have to worry about how I was meeting up other people's expectations. I could be, well, where's Erin at right now? And how can she sort of progress, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So before I go on here, I do want to again define a few terms. So Lori, explain to me, if you can. I see learning differences, difficulties, disabilities, disorders. Like, can you just clarify some of that for us?
So learning differences really is that we all learn differently, right? So everybody has a different method or modality in which they learn best. And I see that a lot, finding your child's learning style, trying to cater to that. And to a certain extent, that's great. But a holistic approach to learning is always best, right? The way more touching, more feeling, visual, whatever. So all of those modalities are probably the best way in order to instruct. So that kind of hits the learning differences. Learning difficulties is really, again, just that we sometimes have difficulties in learning things because of the way our brain is wired. And to a certain extent, some people have difficulties that are more severe than others. And some of it is semantics, and some of it is political correctness and how we address, right, and trying to help people not be stigmatized for having a learning disability or a difference in learning, right? So sometimes those things are interchangeable.
That's a question. So learning difficulty and learning disability are interchangeable?
And I think it depends on who you're talking to at the time, what the current research is and basically what they're going to call it at this point, right? And so I think that's, So
it's fair that in that category, dyslexia, dysgraphia, what's the other one?
Dyscalculia.
Dyscalculia are in?
Yeah.
Would that be in that?
Yeah. And so those are learning disorders, learning difficulties, and technically a learning disorder would have to be diagnosed officially, right? You wouldn't get accommodations officially unless you're diagnosed.
All right. And just again, for our listening audience, how would you, like, very briefly, or I can, but dyslexia, we would say, kind of falls in the reading. Dyscalculia
or dyscalculia.
That is, I always think of Count Dracula, but that's that's an issue in math
or numbers.
Or numbers. And I kind of did read, well, that was interesting. Okay, I'll come back to that. And dysgraphia would be more writing. And that, so my guess is with the dyscalculia, it's numbers and number sense.
Exactly.
And dysgraphia, does that, if that is writing, is that including motor skills?
So not necessarily. So sometimes it's just a disconnect for the brain actually being able to put something physically on paper. And it sometimes goes with motor skills, but for the disorder, I would think it would not have to be.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how are learning disabilities, because you just said diagnosed, and is that something that needs to be done?
So depending on the severity of it, I would say if you have a moderate to severe learning disability or disorder, I would definitely seek having it officially diagnosed. And that has to be done by a psychoanalyst, neuropsych professional. That they give the test. Generally, it's a Wechsler intelligence test with some type of achievement test. And they can give many other different tests to pinpoint specifically where the issues are. And what you're doing is you're taking a general IQ test, which then tells you, okay, according to this test, you have the ability to be wherever that is, and your achievement, right, is not matching in one area or more areas in order to tell us what that disability is.
Okay, so then I'm thinking, so, and correct me if I'm wrong, this is different than, say, special needs, is it?
This is different than special needs. So things, like Down syndrome would be a different category than a learning disorder.
Or even maybe, like I'm thinking about if a person has, like you're saying, a limited IQ, like if there's a cognitive deficiency that's different. So I think what you're saying here, correct me, is so there are those that maybe have a cognitive deficiency that can't learn to the same fullness as, say, somebody with these situations. They have the IQ, they have the ability to learn. So we're kind of saying, but you're being held back. So we're kind of saying, what are the strategies to get you to your full potential?
Exactly.
Okay, good. And so then, so you have them diagnosed. So that's somebody different than you.
Yes. I do not have the training in order to do that testing.
So let's say somebody has this done, they have this tested, they find out what their student is, what their deficiency or difference is. Then what do they do?
So then they can either decide whether they want to pursue educational therapy as a way of helping that student to retrain the brain, or you can get tutors basically for the areas that you find the deficiencies in order to find accommodations for how to manage at that level. But generally you're kind of throwing it into specific tutoring areas without the underlying issue being solved.
So that was one thing I sort of noticed. So like with a tutor, and taking the example of math, you might come to a tutor to learn the processes or to get some more help in the processes for math, maybe working in algebra, whatever. But an educational therapist is going to help you in that, what supports that, which is number sense. Strengthening,
working memory. So working memory is a huge factor in many learning disabilities because if you don't have working memory, you can't manipulate material enough to be able to store it in long-term memory. And so if it's a dyslexia problem, if it's dyscalculia, if it's attention deficit, if it's, executive functioning issues, it's generally stemming from a working memory issue. And so, we help them to strengthen that working memory in order to manipulate it long enough in order to do something with it then.
Right. And so that's where the student who you've been working with them, I'm talking about the parent or maybe even a tutor, and you're just not seeing progress.
Right.
And so that means there's something deeper, and that's where you would come in.
Exactly.
Okay, so So that is when I would seek your services.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
Yep.
And then what would be, how would you know that this was successful? Like in other ways, like would I be able to assess that, okay, my student is making progress?
Sure. So we do intake testing, depending on what kind of testing you have done from your neuropsych, right? I take that testing, I prescript a plan for you based on what that testing shows. And so we do strategies and activities that develop specifically what you need. And then we do the Woodcock-Johnson as an achievement test. And sometimes the neuropsych gives that as their, what the difference between the IQ and the achievement is. And if that's the case, then we'll take that and we'll do end of the year testing, which then shows where we've made progress.
Okay. And then does medication play a role in this?
Yeah, so sometimes students literally cannot attend to whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? If their whole time is just trying to focus on sitting still and that is all that their brain can achieve at that time, you're not getting any other learning, right? And so we have to sometimes work with medication. Sometimes, it's not needed depending on the severity of it. And so I think you have to work with your doctor as far as that goes. But that whole thing is such a long plan too, is working with medications and figuring out the right one for your child.
So I'm hearing three. Then there's the neuro. Who was the first guy? What was his name again? The
neuropsychologist. Mm-hmm.
Then you've got the educational therapist, but then we have a medical doctor.
Absolutely.
Do we need medication?
Right. Well, and I would say you start with your medical doctor, right? You're going to start with a medical doctor to rule out any physical issues that might happen, right? If your child doesn't seem to be hearing you, it may not be a hearing process. It might be literally that they have earwax built up in their ears. So, right? So we want to start there and then go from that. Yeah.
And what I appreciate that you said was if your child is using all their energy to be able to sit still, you're not going to get any learning. And what I appreciate about that is because sometimes we look at a child with one of these situations and we think they're lazy,
right.
They're disobedient,
mm-hmm.
They're, it's some character flaw, but in fact, they're actually working as hard as they possibly can.
Absolutely. Yes, I agree. I hear that a lot from parents who have come to me and said, I really just thought they were lazy, or I thought it was an issue with perfectionism, or I thought that they just couldn't do it, right? And they can. It just they need to have that support and they need to have strategies and tools.
Right. So have you, by doing this, can you share any successes, students maybe you've worked with and seen?
Sure. So I have a student who really was having trouble reading, and very lovely young lady, and she took the test this past year for her final school test, and she was able to do the reading part for the first time in however long she's been doing school, right? So, and it's just really neat to hear those stories. I have a student that I'm working with now, and the mom, I've been working with him for only about 6 weeks, and the mom said he's a different child.
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you start taking those children who have not been successful and you start showing them where they can be successful, they have the willingness to try, right? Because again, we come back to that, right? Of, when I have students who come and say, I can't, we're like, no, we're not allowed to say I can't anymore. When you say I can't, my brain stops working. We actually shut off neural pathways when we say I can't or I don't know. So a new strategy is, well, what questions can I ask to find out more information about that, right? And so we start giving them tools even to ask questions that self-advocate for themselves, right? I don't understand what you said. Can you say it differently, right? So that I understand more. Can I do that in a different way that makes sense? Or what did you do there that worked that you could apply somewhere else? So when I'm doing these activities with them, I'm always relating it back to a real world, right? Why does organization in our schoolwork matter? How do we do that, right? Why does it matter to your room that your schoolwork is neat, or that we have an organized, way of doing things?
That would help a lot of parents right there.
There, yes. Um, So the whole methodology really is based on asking them questions. For those of you who know classical learning, that Socratic method of questioning and trying to figure out what it is that I know, what I don't know, where can I get information, and how can I organize that information, and what strategies worked, and how can I apply those strategies to something else I'm doing.
And what I love about that, and I can see why this boy in just 6 weeks already feels better, is that what feels like an impossible chasm now has at least been recognized, and you can begin to build that bridge across.
Yes.
And having those tools is so powerful. And recognizing that it's okay if you don't understand something. It's okay if there's a disconnect. There's
Yes.
a way to get to a connect.
Mm-hmm.
And I know personally, for me, and it's funny you say classical education, because of course we both love it, and it's just been such a powerful help in my life and with my kids. But I remember feeling, like I said, I can't learn. I don't know how to learn. Everybody knows all these things and I don't know them. But once I realized how to learn, and that there were these skills and ways, and that I could ask questions, and that I didn't have to be ashamed that I didn't know something.
Absolutely.
But rather, I could use these skills to figure it out. It opened a whole world, not only of knowledge, but relationship.
Absolutely.
Because before, I was intimidated if I didn't know something to maybe even build that relationship. But now I'm comfortable to ask questions and learn. And wow, that's awesome, Lori.
Yeah. It's really fun. We call it the power of yet. I don't know that yet, but I can ask questions and I can find strategies and I can learn it.
I love that, the power of yet. Well, our time is almost over. I hate to close this conversation, but is there any last thing that you might say to a homeschool parent? Maybe they are recognizing some struggles in their children, or I don't know. What might you say to them?
I would say, parents, don't be afraid to ask questions. And if you have a gut feeling that something is wrong, something probably is wrong. So, a lot of times we'll chalk up not reading, oh, well, they're just not mature enough yet, or, just give them time. But if they're not doing foundational things like being able to rhyme, being able to, do those things that need to be done developmentally in reading, they might need more help. And so, don't be afraid to reach out and ask somebody who, has been there, how to improve, even just getting them started on a path that, will set them up for success early.
So I have to ask, because I think that's excellent. So what age should my child be rhyming? Like, I'm trying to think what age, because I'll talk to parents and they'll, sometimes it'll be super, super young. And like you say, some people say, oh, no, you can wait, till they're
Right.
8. Give us a ballpark, a little bit.
Yeah, so probably by about 4 or 5, they should be able to be playing with words and being able to hear the patterns in words. And you should be able to, have those nursery rhymes and find out what words say the same. They may not know the word rhyme, right? But we can play with words in order to do that, and know their beginning sounds, and know that I hear p at the beginning and it means, P, or t and it's T, right? So if they're not getting those, I would get some help with that. If they're not being able to count things in order, right, by 5 or 6, and they're not having that kind of object permanency where I can put this number and I can count them and I know that this comes next in that sequencing, you know, they might need some help with that. So, and I'm not saying that every child, you know, is going to develop the same, but those are kind of ballpark figures.
And what you're saying is you go ahead and meet with your medical doctor and start, and they might say, no, everything is fine, but at least you're beginning on that path.
Right.
I do want to encourage parents, because another research I did, I saw that it said like over 4 million children in the US have at least one learning disability, and about just about 2%, I think it said 1 in 59 children live with more than one learning disability. And sometimes because of these differences and because of the emotional feelings they have, they can also be targeted for bullying. So they tend to be, you know, bullied more. So it's really important to have your eye on these things. Seek out the professionals. It's so exciting that today we have done all this study.
Yes.
You know.
Yeah, and I would just say early intervention can mean the difference between a child who is successful and children who just struggle for the rest of their educational career. And so, you know, pinpointing those things and helping them earlier rather than later, I think is really important.
Well, Lori, this has been so good. And I know parents are going to appreciate hearing this and getting sort of this insight as they consider homeschooling their children. And if they're seeing some things, this is going to encourage them that go get help. And go get help, because your children, there are strategies to help them to be successful.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a delight. I love it. Thank you.
Wasn't that a great interview with Lori Horner? And aren't you thankful for her input and insight? I hope you feel much more equipped to be able to homeschool your children regardless of their learning strengths. And if you enjoyed our video today, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe so you can be notified each time we make new content. And we appreciate all your comments and interactions so that we can better equip you and help you on your homeschool journey. And remember, yes, you can homeschool.